Hello, hello, hello. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. We have a very special event today that I am super excited about. But first, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Tom Blute, and I am the events manager for Interabang Books. For those of you who don't know Interabang, we're a local independent Dallas bookstore. We are so delighted that our brick and mortar store can have its doors open. Of course, if you do come in, we're asking everyone to wear a mask over their nose and mouth. But come on in, we're open and we'd love to see you, your smiling eyes and all that. I'll say that we do have a lot of events coming up. In particular, in this next week, I do want to recommend that everybody keep their ears and eyes out because we're hosting Jewel Parker Rhodes on Tuesday, May 11th at 6 p.m. And she's going to be joined in conversation by St. Philip's headmaster, Dr. Terry Flowers. So do keep an eye out. That's going to be a fantastic event, all based around a reissue of her book from a couple of years ago, Magic City, talking about the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. A little later on next week, on the 13th, that's Thursday, we're hosting Stacey Swan with her new book, Olympus, Texas. You folks might have heard about Stacey Swan today because she was on NPR's morning news edition, weekend edition this morning. So if you'd like to join that, just keep an ear and an eye out for Thursday the 13th at 6 p.m. We're going to be hosting her virtually, so we're very, very excited about that as well. I'll say if you'd like to find out more about our virtual events, you can do so at interabangbooks.com. That's our website. We're also, of course, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can see us and all of our upcoming events on any of those. For folks who are watching this right now on Facebook and the live stream, I do recommend after this event concludes, you can click on over to our events and see all those upcoming things that we're excited about and would love to share with you. Now, I'll say, for any of those folks who have questions, whether you're in the Zoom webinar with us or you're on Facebook Live, we do invite you to have your questions answered today. You can drop your questions if you're in the Zoom feed, just drop them down that little Q&A box and I'll relay them to our author. And if you are on the Facebook Live, you drop them in the comment section under this stream and I'd be happy to take care of those questions for you here. I will also say that we're thrilled this afternoon to have Alexander Wolff joining us. Alexander is the author of ENDPAPERS that many of you folks might remember as our March signed first editions book club pick. I'll also say in conversation with Alex today is Lori Feathers, our very own Lori Feathers, who's the adult book buyer of the store and the curator of our signed first edition book club. So I will say we're looking forward to this fantastic discussion between these two fine folks. And I will now turn the floor right over to Lori, though I will note for folks who would like to know more about Alexander, as you can see on those gorgeous portraits behind him, he is a noted sports journalist before he wrote this and continues to be a noted sports journalist. So I would encourage you, if you got any questions along those lines, do keep them in mind. We're happy to get some questions answered a little later in the program. Lori, please, ma'am, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Tom. Such a pleasure today to welcome you, Alex, to our event today, hosted by Interabang Books. And it was really a great joy for me to discover your book. And I think it's the perfect kind of book for our Sign First subscribers because it's the type of book that makes you think about interesting existential questions, but it's also a book about the love of books in a lot of ways too. So I wondered if you might want to kick off the event, Alex, by reading a short passage from the book.
I'd love to, Lori. Thanks so much for the welcome. Yeah, and the book unspools as a result of a year I spent with my family in Berlin, poking into the family history. It's an amalgam of history and memoir, but also journalism. You know, I'm trained as a journalist. As Tom mentioned, a sports journalist, mostly basketball. And in going over to Berlin, I was just determined that the city and what was going on in the world at the time would find its way into this book, even though it was going to be a book of history. So what I'd love to do to kind of orient everyone in the story a little bit is read a short passage from the beginning of the book, near the beginning of the book. And it's actually about me getting oriented in Berlin and the family. We moved to a part of Berlin called Kreuzberg, which is a very happening, lively, immigrant-inflected part of the city. And this will give you a sense of exactly what we were in the middle of. Each morning, our kids go off to school on an S-Bahn headed for the Wannsee, where in January 1942, the Nazis signed off on the final solution. In the afternoon, they return on a train bound for Oranienburg, from where the SS oversaw it. We buy meat and produce in the market hall in which Karl Herz, the Jewish mayor of Kreuzberg, after being chased from City Hall and dragged through the streets by brown shirts of the SA, was beaten on a spring day in 1933. Walking around our Kiez, as Berliners call a neighborhood, we come across some of the more than 5,000 Stolpersteine, or stumbling stones, brass cobblestone memorials nested in the sidewalks of the city, each commemorating a Berliner victimized by the Nazis and set outside the last home he or she freely chose. Dates of detention and murder come inscribed beneath each name in recitative simplicity. The power of the Stolpersteine lies in their subtle obtrusiveness. Whereas you must consciously make a distant destination of immured monochromatic gravestones in a cemetery, stumbling stones glint up at you throughout the open city, nuggets in the creek bed. To read an inscription, you bend at the waist in a kind of bow of respect. As memorials go, Stolpersteine derive an animating power from being a work in progress, as tens of thousands of Berliners are yet to be memorialized. It's a sobering fact, the historian Timothy Snyder points out, that cultures of memory are organized by round numbers, intervals of 10, but somehow the remembrance of the dead is easier when the numbers are not round, when the final digit is not a 0. That's precisely why each stone in our neighborhood calls out as it does, testifying to the meaning of one particular spot in the life of one particular person, insisting on its place in our daily routine. Cross the street to the ice cream stand, weighing whether to enjoy one scoop or two, but only after you remember Wilhelm Böttcher, the widower with a wooden leg, who, rather than finger other gay Berliners, killed himself in September 1936 in the Alexanderplatz jail 2 weeks after police took him into custody. Fill out a transfer slip at the bank on the corner, and you do so steps from where a month apart in early 1943, the Jewish cousins Ruth Gerstel and Erwin Ronas were detained and deported. Fate unknown, their stone tells us. Approach the threshold of the nearest chain store to buy sundries, and you're reminded that a tailor and postal worker named Martin Jaffe, who performed 6 years of forced labor at a chemical plant in nearby Tempelhof, lived here in a third-floor apartment before being arrested at work in February 1943, whereupon the Nazis, having decided to bring in captured Slavs from the East to replace Jews like Jaffe, sent him first to the ghetto at Theresienstadt and then to his death. Just around the corner from where we live, the stumbling stone nearest to us, Erna Wolff, deported on December 14th, 1942, murdered in Auschwitz. No relation as far as I know, and I really don't know. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of us getting our bearings when my family and I went over there. And some of the themes that I'd be grappling with in the book are starting to emerge. I should say very briefly that this book is the story of my grandfather, my father, and me. It's a neat patrilineal line. My grandfather was a book publisher who published these titanic literary figures before World War I in Germany, including Franz Kafka. And then he was forced into exile. So many of his authors were considered degenerate by the Nazis. So before the Nazis took power after World War I, there was this horrible hyperinflation that helped doing his business too, but it became clear that once the Reichstag burned that he had to get out. So he and my step-grandmother light out for first London, where they got married, then they go to France, then Italy, back to France, and then through Spain and Portugal to New York, where they arrive in 1941. My father, on the other hand, and here's the central irony in the book, my father, because of a divorce, winds up with his mother as of 1930. And she is not Jewish at all. His father had been half Jewish, and has a very comfortable life because she is the heiress to the Merck pharmaceutical empire. And he goes off to boarding school. He's in the Hitler Youth as a result. He's only a quarter Jewish, which isn't so Jewish that the Nazis wouldn't send you first to the Russian front as part of the invasion of the Soviet Union. And then when fortunes of the war turned, he was sent to the Western front. He was captured at the Battle of the Bulge by the Americans. So almost simultaneously with my grandfather being in exile, founding Pantheon Books in New York as an exile in 1941-42, my dad is literally serving Hitler on the Eastern Front in the Soviet Union. So that's the central thing that I'm trying to unravel and trying to unpack in this city, Berlin, which is just soaked in history. Fortunately, there are many archives, letters survived, and there are a number of cousins who know this history very well I was able to chase down, but that's essentially the gist of the book.
Well, I was really taken with that. It almost seemed like a paradox, something very unexpected, that your grandfather Kurt was an exile fleeing the Nazis at the same time that his son and your father Nico was serving in the Nazi army during World War II. And that seems like a quite a unique story. Perhaps it's not, but it seemed different. But I want to go back a little bit because you're very generous with giving us an expansive family tree at the beginning of the book. And I referred back to that so many times. It was extremely helpful. But you do go back and research kind of the life of the family before Kurt and Nico, your grandfather and father. And one of the things that you kind of find out is that there's a history of anti-Jewish sentiment in the country, in Germany, well before Hitler's coming to power, and also how this affected your extended family centuries before. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it was probably one of the most astonishing things I discovered. I mean, I knew that I had these Jewish ancestors, but it turns out they were really influential. If you go back to the early part of the 19th century, not just in Germany, but all over Europe, there were these central figures in the way these duchies were set up. And they were largely Jewish, and they were essentially secretaries of the treasury or court bankers, as they were known. And they're usually Jewish, certainly in Germany they were. And in the Duchy of Baden in Germany's southwest, a direct ancestor of mine, Solomon Haber, he became von Haber because the Grand Duke was so pleased by the service he gave the state. He was the court banker, became very wealthy, and he had a number of children, the male ones of which went into business and became prosperous themselves. And there were 2 rounds of anti-Semitic riots that these ancestors of mine were victimized by. Their house invaded in each case, 24 years apart before the middle of the 19th century. I discovered in a genealogical essay my aunt had written just this throwaway line about Moritz von Haber, this ancestor of ours. And she described him as a rake and a duelist and all sorts of fascinating things, a womanizer. And sure enough, come to find out, all of the European papers were full of stories contemporaneously about Moritz von Haber, who was a bit of a provocateur. He kind of liked to get under people's skin. He liked the fact that people spread rumors about his romantic life. And he at one point had to do what people in the 19th century did when they felt their honor had been impugned. He had to enter into a duel, and he ended up being involved in 2 duels, was not killed, but the others in the duels, in 2 cases were. So I retell that story, and it's very early in the book. But of course, again, you pointed out the irony, Lori. Here I have these Jewish ancestors, yet when Hitler rises to power, not only does my dad, because he's drafted, he's 12 when Hitler comes to power, he has to serve in the Wehrmacht. But it turns out, I discover in an archive in Berlin, that his favorite uncle, his beloved uncle Wilhelm, was in the SS, and that this family company, and I know this largely because the company in a great corporate reckoning a few years ago commissioned this fabulous history, no holds barred history, was very cozy with the Third Reich. And it's all very disconcerting. There is a historian in the Dallas area named Brian Rigg, who's written a fabulous book called Hitler's Jewish Soldiers that I consulted again and again. There were apparently 150,000 or so Germans of Jewish descent, of some degree of Jewishness, certainly not full Jews, but Jews in some degree or other, who served in the armed forces of the Third Reich. So my dad's journey wasn't all that unusual. I think what was so unusual is that contemporaneous with him serving, his father is, I mean, at one point, he and my step-grandmother were literally writing leaflets that were to be dropped by French aircraft over westernmost parts of Germany, propaganda leaflets that they wrote for the French Foreign Ministry, which meant, of course, that when they're hiding out in France and the Germans invade, the peril that they would be in if the Gestapo got a hold of them was off the charts. So they had very anxious moments during those months when they were trying to get out.
Well, you stated in your opening that your grandfather, Kurt, kind of, when he fled Germany, or was exiled rather, for, publishing provocative literature, he and your step-grandmother kind of hopped, skipped, and jumped around Europe, eventually coming to New York and forming Pantheon Books in 1941. Your father, Nico, got to the US only after the war, and after he served in the war, around 1948, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. And you yourself went to Berlin about a decade after your father, Nico, passed away. I think that's what I recall. And maybe you could tell me a little bit about your relationship with your father and the kinds of things about his past that you guys talked about and the things that you didn't talk about.
Well, it's been fascinating to me how many readers of the book have been so engaged with actually what you just described, Lori, that part of the book, this sort of, what do I do with my past if I'm trying to make my way through the 50s and 60s as a new American? And we all know what the 50s and early 60s were like in America. I think people identified with that, and I'm so glad they did. It was easy to write about my grandfather and the illustrious writers that he published, and the way he kind of sat astride this world, two worlds, the European world and the American world. But my dad was he was a guy who was very, very lucky, not just to survive the Russian front and then the Battle of the Bulge and captivity, but his dad had become an American citizen by 1948 and could vouch for him, so my dad could come over to study. This was at a time when Germany didn't even exist again as an independent state, couldn't issue passports to any of their citizens. So it's highly unusual. But once he gets to the States, he's determined to forge ahead, to embark on this new life, to embrace the spirit of the 50s, which was, anything's possible in the US. And he did. He got a job with a PhD in chemistry, he got a job at DuPont and then Xerox and RCA, and met my mom, had once planted a victory garden only a few years earlier, hoping for the annihilation of the army of which her husband was a part. The ironies just pile up. But my relationship with my dad, particularly as regarded his past, was fascinating. I mean, there were things about having grown up in Bavaria, whether it was beer or Wurst or music, Papa music, that were so much a part of him that he still adored. He never dodged questions I might have asked him about his military service and what it was like. But if I'm being honest, I'm telling you, I didn't ask those questions to any great degree. I was quite happy to be set up by my hardworking dad and my doting mom and see how far I could go in the America of the 70s and 80s and 90s. And it was really only in the mid 90s when we take this cruise down the Danube that I devote a chapter to, where we're literally going, it begins in Nuremberg, I guess symbolically is the most meaningful geographic point of that whole trip. And we talked about all sorts of things, and I eventually summoned my courage to ask some of these hard questions. I wish, of course, that he were still around so I could have asked him so many more questions that occurred to me in that year of research. But I understand why he was burying that past. I completely do. And I think the most disturbing thing I discovered, and here's a signal I got from my dad. He wrote religiously letters home to his mom in Munich, and his mom in Munich, my grandmother, saved them all. And before my dad died, he translated those letters and gave my sisters and me a copy of the translation. And in reading them after he died, I could see how well he ate, especially during that period he was in Ukraine and the Soviet Union. And in reading history that I felt I had to read to help contextualize all the diaries and letters that I was playing with, I discovered that he was eating well, not by accident, that as part of their genocidal plans, the Nazis hoped to starve the Slavic peasantry, Jews, Soviet prisoners, and that the food that would otherwise go to them would keep the soldiers fed and go back to the Reich to keep German citizens fat and happy and supporting the war effort. And like so many of us, I was raised to assume that the Holocaust took place in camps in the woods in places like Poland. And it never occurred to me that something like this had been instituted, or that a simple grunt in the military like my dad could be conscripted into something so, be implicated into something just so awful. And it was in Berlin that I had this revelation. And the hardest thing probably to grapple with was that. But in no way have I abandoned my attempts to try to understand my dad's predicament. History just wraps us up in the same way history wrapped my grandfather up in this maelstrom and sent him on this exile and flight. It picked my dad up. He's 12 when Hitler comes into power. He's in 1941 when he gets out of boarding school and is immediately sent off to invade the Soviet Union. So it's a very, very grim thing to consider what history has in store for us, and I guess turns it back on us to do all that we can do to shape the course of history.
You start the book with a prologue, and you talk about one of the first experiences that you can recall where your father and your interests kind of converged, and that was watching the evening news concerning Watergate during that time, and sitting there and being quite rapt and fascinated by it. And I recall, I'm paraphrasing here, I'm not going to say it as eloquently as you wrote it, but at the end of that short prologue, you say something like, along the lines that you think that your father's fascination with it in part was because he was able to see public officials defying authority on moral and ethical grounds, and that was compelling to both of you. But it probably had a special type of interest for him, I think, because one would have to think that was kind of a theme that would have had to have gone through his head a lot in life, whether or not, he and his friends and your relatives should have or could have or thought about doing something different than they did, than serving their country in that way at the time.
Yeah, my dad was very acutely aware that he had a second chance, I think, in so many ways, but that democracy, he had a second chance to live in a democracy. And Yeah, Watergate. It was particularly the Saturday Night Massacre when President Nixon ordered that his attorney general fire the special prosecutor, and not just the attorney general, but the assistant attorney general who then took over refused to do the deed. And this moved my dad a lot. I mean, the idea that public servants don't follow orders wasn't something that he observed growing up in Nazi Germany. And seeing things like that, the other example that is burned into my mind, we lived in New Jersey during the 60s, right next to someone who was an executive with the Boy Scouts. Their national headquarters are just up Route 1 in central New Jersey. And this neighbor was a kindly man, and he would slip me copies of Boy's Life. And I wanted nothing more than to be in the Boy Scouts. And my dad would have none of it. And this was immediately traceable back to the Hitler Youth. And my dad had no choice when he was at boarding school. He would go to Heimabend once a week, and they would wear their uniform. And it just had that paramilitary feel that had just gone so sideways in his experience. And I do remember in the moment him explaining that, it was more kind of cast as, you don't play army. This is something that my friends and I around the neighborhood did. I mean, World War II was still pretty recent. And virtually all my friends, their dads had served in the US military. And my dad just saw this from a very different perspective. And it was sort of pulling back some of those memories from my youth that bring my dad's journey so vividly to light. But yeah, democracy was something he really did feel a special investment in. And in some ways, as much as you can hope to be captured, I know that from the moment that the GI who confiscated his camera, his Leica from him when he was being processed after being captured, from the moment that GI insisted, oh, I need to compensate you for that camera, and gave him a carton of cigarettes, which my dad, of course, was able to barter for things that were essential to easing his survival. He had this sense that America had promise and honor and just something that he wanted to make a part of his future. And of course, he also knew that his father had become an American citizen, or would soon learn that once they were back in touch. And the idea that that could actually happen must have been very, very giddy to contemplate.
You talk in the book about a German cousin and also godson, I think, of your father, cousin Nico. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about him and his life in Germany?
Yeah, this cousin of mine, he's cousin removed, but his father and my father were first cousins. And my cousin Nico's father, Emmanuel, had a very different wartime experience. Now, my dad was very fortunate. He's on the Eastern Front, and he spots a notice in the barracks that says that leaves are available for soldiers who want to study chemistry back at the Technical Institute in Munich. So my dad, desperate to get off the Russian front, he'd always wanted to be an architect, but this was a little change in career that he was happy to contemplate if it meant getting him back to Munich. He applies and he somehow gets this gig, and it gets him out of Russia for about 5 critical months. And by the time he's redeployed, they send him to the West, to where he'll be captured by the Americans. So it was really something that saved his life. Now, his cousin Emmanuel, my cousin Nico's father, did not have that good fortune. And he's captured by the Soviets. He doesn't get back to Germany until 3 or 4 years after the war ends, and in a very, very bad way, and dies very young. So I think my cousin Nico has processed a lot of this stuff in a very different way than I have, because it just hit so close to home, losing his father at such a young age. Now, the other thing that's different between my cousin Nico and I, we're virtually the same age, is that having grown up in Germany, he went through this process of grappling with the German past and the Nazi era, because you just did that if you were part of his generation. I'm part of that generation too, but I'm an American, so it just never presented itself. And that was one of the reasons to go to Berlin and undertake this. And he asked me very pointedly when we first moved why we were there, and I explained this. And he recognized, he nodded his head and said, yeah, most of us have already been through that. But he kind of tipped his hat, I think, to the fact that I was taking up the task.
Can you talk a little bit about, I think most of the listeners know the name Merck Pharmaceuticals. And of course, that name has a special significance because that's a family business in your extended family. I think on your grandmother's side, is that right?
That's right.
And can you talk a little bit about the things that you found out about Merck and their involvement with the Nazis?
So the Merck that we know in the States was founded by an ancestor of mine who emigrated in the late 19th century to New Jersey and founded it there. And then when World War I happens, the US government basically confiscates that because it's a German firm and lets the Americanized Mercs who've emigrated run it after the war. But that marks the beginning of the separation of the American Merck branch and the German Merck branch. So the German Merck branch is really the one that I'm tied up with. And indeed, it was my dad's mother, who was Elizabeth Merck, who married Kurt Wolff. And some of that Merck money helped fund Kurt's publishing activities back in the early days. But yes, Merck started back in the 17th century when a little apothecary in Darmstadt, Germany, some way back forebear figured out a way to isolate the opium poppy, the essence of the opium poppy, and put together all sorts of lotions and potions and became more than just a pharmaceutical firm, but also a chemical firm. And indeed, when the Nazi war effort is underway, come to find out, they supplied raw material that went into rocket fuel. But perhaps most sensationally, they also provided a couple of drugs that were instrumental, not just in the Nazi war effort, but also in treating Adolf Hitler. Hitler became addicted, some historians argue, to a drug called Oikodal, which is essentially the same drug as oxycodone, which we know all too well, tragically, through OxyContin. And also Merck was one of the pioneers in marketing cocaine, legal cocaine around the world. So at one point, Merck cocaine and Merck Eucadol were, in a kind of speedball fashion, were influencing how Adolf Hitler was behaving, particularly from mid-44 to the end of the war, when by all historical accounts, he's more delusional and he's in the bunker, and these drugs are having a direct effect on history and these decisions that are being made. So that, along with the discovery about the hunger plan and how well my dad ate when he was in the East, finding out that my ancestors were also essentially supplying drugs to Hitler was another pretty sobering discovery during the course of my research.
You had, I think, a real benefit in going back and looking at your family, because from my perspective anyway, it seems like there's abundant correspondence, because your grandfather, Kurt, was very much a man of letters, and he had, as you would think, a publisher back in those days when letter writing was still very much a thing, a way to communicate. All of these just kind of eloquent and beautiful letters and correspondence between your grandfather and famous authors, and then your grandfather and family members when he was in the United States, and they were in different parts of the world. And also, I don't know, maybe because of the prominence of your family in Germany, a famous publisher, and then on your grandmother's side, this, very wealthy family from the pharmaceutical companies. You've got, there just seems to be a lot of really tangible things that you could look to. But are there questions that you just never really found the answers to, or things that you were digging into, factual things that still remained a mystery even today?
Yeah, I would say that's absolutely true about all the raw material I had to work with. There was a point in my research I remember thinking, boy, I'm glad I'm doing this, because I don't I don't see how I could justify not doing it, given all this stuff that's sort of sitting here in my lap. But yeah, I'd say the biggest mystery, lingering mystery, is just what it is that my dad saw. Not so much what he did, but what he saw during the war. He never told me about something he told my brother-in-law, who told me after my dad's death, which was just before he was captured. The German military at that point was being splintered into all these little groups, and people were just recombining in squads of 6, 7, 8 soldiers at a time. And the ranking officer in my dad's group was one of these dead enders, probably an SS officer, who was ready to fight to the death. And everybody else under his command was adamant that all was lost and that they should arrange to surrender. And there was an angry argument, and one member of my dad's unit, when this commanding officer turned his back, shot him dead. And that was something my dad never mentioned. I didn't know to ask. And I'm sure in the Soviet Union, what was going on with reprisals, the hunger plan, there were things that he must have seen just routinely during that year and a half he was in the Ukraine. Not supervising atrocities that I know took place, because I've done some research. I know from the postmarks on letters he sent home where he was on certain dates, and we know when pits were dug and Jews were shot in certain places in the Soviet Union. But what he saw and just how traumatized he might have been, and I know in writing home to his mom that he spared her the worst of it. I mean, he knew his mother was a very fine woman who wanted to present herself in the salon, and he didn't want her to worry unduly. So he tends to go out of his way in his letters, I think, to reassure her. But I wonder what it was, just how bad it was, what he was a part of and what he witnessed.
And do you think that your mom knew a lot more than you did?
That's a great question. I'm guessing that my mom was part of my dad's project of assimilation, and that sounds terrible as I say it, because it doesn't frame my mom as the intimate to my dad that she was, and but I do think that my dad's attitude was very much in emigrating and assimilating was there's a hard break. There's a hard break with the past. There was a point I remember in the 70s where he was able to get another family member to buy out all the shares that he'd inherited in Merck, Germany. And he was delighted to have that tie cut. He just didn't want that connection. And I think if my dad suffered from any PTSD type things, he did a pretty good job of masking it. But I think just in the same way that he wanted to spare my sisters and me the worst of what he had been through and seen and grown up in, he certainly didn't want to foist that on my mom.
Yeah. I'm going to take a step back a little bit or out of the very, the book itself, but I'm wondering, in your years of sports journalism and writing for Sports Illustrated and writing books about sports figures, predominantly basketball figures, was there anything about that work that you kind of thought was especially relevant, or skills that you were surprised that you were able to use in this work, on this book?
Well, it's funny you asked that, because I always say I'm not a historian, I'm not a memoirist, I'm a journalist. But I did do a lot of stories for Sports Illustrated over the year on great historical moments, or kind of untold historical stories in sports. And they're wonderful ones. I did a story about the first Texas high school baseball champion, Bowie High of El Paso, that was all Mexican-American. So a wonderful story of, they won 4 straight games, the first time the championship ever took place, and went up to Austin and won the title. And it's just this just uplifting tale. So I knew my way around mining the past. I knew how to approach an archive and kind of find my way through it. But interestingly, one of the things I've learned in profiling athletes and interviewing coaches, they tend to be male. they tend to have armor. It's kind of a psychological, emotional armor. They don't let their guard down. And it's the women around them. It's been my experience. If you can get them to talk, if you can get to the mom or the grandmother who raised them, or the sister who might have kept a scrapbook, or helped dress the skin knee back in the day, they've seen the failures. They understand the kind of emotional arc that these otherwise very stoic people that I'm encountering in their moment of glory. I wouldn't be writing about them unless they're having some success. And interestingly, this book, and I've told you it's a book about three men, generationally kind of lined up, but you've read the book, Laura, you know that there are these voices of women, the most moving letters, the descriptive passages of a bombing raider from my Aunt Maria. The most emotionally affecting letter in the book is my step-grandmother writing my grandmother, these two women who were both married to the same man, my grandfather, after his death. And my step-grandmother's dishing about how impossible he was. So to hear all these female voices, it's almost like the Greek chorus commenting on the men who aren't pausing to reflect on their lives. So that did occur to me in the midst of it all. It wasn't as though I was actually deploying my sports writing skills. It was more, I was recognizing a phenomenon from a lot of the sports writing that I'd done.
And I wonder, because in a lot of ways, your book speaks to the power of reinventing a life and the opportunities that this country gave to both your grandfather and your father. And I'm wondering how that has colored your perspective on the immigration problems that we have today, mostly here, but then also in Europe. I'm sure that was a huge issue in Berlin in 2017 when you were there as well.
Oh, yes. I mean, new Americans, both my father and grandfather were welcomed by the United States, and they were each in their own way able to realize their dreams because they were given a chance. Now, I'm not deluding myself into thinking that it didn't help that they were male and that they were white and that they were Western European, maybe is a better way to put it, and that they had a certain privilege that allowed them to maybe present themselves to people making decisions. I mean, the very fact that my grandfather got an emergency visa from the US State Department is because there was an angel named Varian Fry who was working in Marseille trying to get distinguished intellectuals, writers, artists out, and which is already, playing God in a kind of way. So there was enormous amounts of luck involved. But there's also this kind of ironic twist to the whole story, which is certainly in my grandfather's case. He builds up a publishing house in Germany before World War I. Then history kind of beats it into the ground through World War I itself, the hyperinflation, and then the rise of the Nazis. So he flees. He goes into exile to the US. Okay, that's a good outcome. He founds Pantheon. It becomes a success. But then, ironically, because Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago becomes this huge seller, there's this terrible boardroom conflict where my grandfather is technically not the president of Pantheon because he was an enemy alien when the firm was founded, and for purposes of getting it all through, they found somebody else to be the titular president of the firm. He loses his boardroom battle and feels he has to flee back to Europe. So he ends his life essentially back in Europe, mostly in Switzerland. Now he does get this little moment of glory where Harcourt Brace brings him on with my step-grandmother, and they establish this imprint called Helen and Kurt Wolff Books. So he had for about a year and a half before he was killed in an accident, this little moment of redemption. But the idea that twice he built up these publishing houses, and twice he kind of had to he was forced essentially to flee them, just adds this layer of poignancy to his whole story.
I think that kind of a little bit similar to that, you go into some detail in the book about the I guess it was after the laws in Germany in around 1935, where you had to make a declaration about your Aryanness, I guess is one way of putting it. And the fact that I think that your grandfather filled that form out for both himself and for your father, and then your father's form got certified, but your grandfather's did not. And it's just kind of, I don't know. I think that there's so much dystopian fiction right now, and thank God it's still fiction. But that seems like so strange, trying to like prove that you're Aryan and not Jewish. But maybe looking back at the immigration stuff that's happening today, let's hope we never get there. But it's not that hard to fathom some of those ugly laws, finding a resurgence again.
Well, and I think that the Isabel Wilkerson book, Caste, which I'm sure you have in Interabang and probably a pile of them. And I mean, she writes in that book how influenced the Nazis were by some of the attitudes toward immigration and immigrants that were prevalent in the US at the time. So it was very much in the air. I mean, the Nazis weaponized it. They didn't look back. They were brutal. They had, because they were in a country where they fetishized keeping records. They could go into any church and find ecclesiastical records. And then sometimes they would pseudo-scientifically pull out, calipers and measure the length of your nose and all that stuff. I mean, my dad's great fortune was that he was considered a quarter Jewish, which meant that you could still remain a member of the German, you could avoid the camps, let me put it that way, but the Germans would never regard you as part of their race and nation. So, of course, the mixed blessing of that is that he was also deemed fit for military service. So the ironies abound. And the other theme that I grapple with a little bit in the book is that my ancestors were very cultivated. They were readers, they were collectors of art and books. I mean, Kurt basically funded his whole exile by selling off parts of this book collection. So for 9 years, he's on the run. And music, they love music. And my grandfather's father had been a choir master and a composer and a lecturer in Bonn at the University of Music. And many German Jews were sort of caught up in that world, the world of Bildung, which is kind of self-cultivation of the arts. And many of them had contributed enormously to them, not just creating great works, but also chronicling them, teaching them, and so forth. And the great irony is that when push came to shove, the non-Jewish lovers of all these things of German culture didn't stand up for the Jewish lovers of it all, who in many cases felt, right up to the late 30s and even the early 40s, that they were protected somehow because, no one loves Germany as much as I do, perhaps even for having served in World War I in the German military with honor. So a lot of ironies coming out down the pike in this book. And I've always been drawn to that paradox. You threw that word out very early in our conversation. But paradox and irony are sometimes a great thing to play with when you're telling a story. Because I do think readers, when they run across something like that, the intelligent reader will instantly, it'll be like the Interabang, it's the question mark and the exclamation point, and just the way those two things are kind of connected to each other.
Yeah, you talked when you were looking back into the history of your family a lot about the long line, not just in your family, but all over Germany, of the baptized Jews. And, all of these families that were Jewish, but in a lot of ways found it more comfortable to to kind of portray or emphasize the non-Jewish parts of their ancestry or their heritage or their tradition. And I think that was, that's one of those paradoxes too. And I was a Russian major in undergrad, and so I know that a lot of that runs through Russian history too. You had all of these very prominent Jewish people, but the anti-Semitism was so rife in Russia, even during, as you know, during World War II, that a lot of people tried to not be Jewish when they could.
Yeah, and that was even back with the von Habers in the early 19th century, as successful as they were, for reasons of wanting to fit into society, sort of cultural adaptation. Many of them converted, got baptized. And, often they would continue to donate to Jewish charities, but just to kind of step out into society, they wanted to kind of buy the admission ticket to German culture. And the paradox again, particularly in the late 19th century when anti-Semitism really got nasty, the 1870s, 1880s in Germany, there was almost a case of the more you tried to integrate and assimilate as a non-Jew and embrace German culture, the more you were kind of identified for your original Jewishness. And of course, the Nazis took that to the extreme, because it was all kind of a genealogical chart game that they were playing. And there was nothing you could do. Now, greater irony here is that Judaism itself regards people who were once a Jew as always being a Jew, exactly the same way as the Nazis did. So, let us hope that we never go down that road again. I mean, if there's one takeaway from this book, there are a lot of roads we hope will get foreclosed as we go forward.
Well, Alex, it's been such a pleasure to talk with you today. And I want to thank you for writing such an interesting and fulfilling and satisfying book. It's a great, it's just so interesting. And there's so many nuances to your family perspective, but also so many things that I think that we can all relate to, even though our families are obviously not your family. But thank you for providing our Sign First subscribers with signed copies of your book. It's always a special treat to get a signed copy of a book, and I know that hasn't been easy to accomplish in these days of the pandemic. And we want to just thank you very much for your time today, and also for providing the signed copies of the book for our subscribers.
Oh, I'm just thrilled that you took an interest in it, and thanks so much for your time and great questions, Lori. Much appreciated.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.